It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Frank stepped into the National Museum of Military Valor, his boots echoing against the marble floor as he entered the Hall of Heroes. The place had changed since the last time he visited, more touch screens, brighter lights, new displays, but the names on the wall remained. Or so he thought. He made his usual slow walk past the World War II Memorial, then Korea, and finally Vietnam. The wall there always made him stop. Etched into the black granite were names of men he knew, some he'd laughed with, others he'd cried beside. His fingers, rough with age, ran along the cool stone as he read them like a prayer. But today, something was wrong. He couldn't find it. "Where the hell is he?" Frank whispered. The name. The name that should have been right under Jackson or above Morales. Joseph A. Connors. The boy who jumped on the grenade. The kid from Brooklyn who sang old Sinatra songs in the trenches to calm their nerves. Frank's mind raced. Maybe he missed it. He scanned again, reading slowly, his heart pounding harder with each pass. No Connors. No Joseph. Not even a J.C. anywhere near. His legs trembled. He sat down on a nearby bench, sweat clinging to his brow despite the museum's chilled air. "They forgot him," he muttered. He tried not to let the anger rise, but it did. He stood up, marched to the front desk, and asked to speak to the curator. The young woman behind the counter offered a soft smile and said he could fill out a feedback form. Frank stared at her blankly. "I need someone who understands what this means," he said. She hesitated, then picked up a phone and called someone upstairs. A few minutes later, a tall man in a blazer appeared, his ID badge swinging from a blue lanyard. "Mr. Frank Delaney," he said. "2nd Infantry, Vietnam. I was with Connors the day he died. And his name isn't up there." The curator raised his brows slightly, then motioned for Frank to follow him. In a back room behind the exhibits, surrounded by dusty folders and filing cabinets, they pulled out a large book, handwritten records of honored names. The page for Joseph Connors was blank. "Nothing?" Frank asked. "How?" The man looked uncomfortable. "Sometimes, names slip through. Records get lost, or there are administrative delays." "Delay?" "It's been over 50 years, Frank snapped. "He saved all of us. He saved me. I wouldn't be here if he hadn't," his voice caught. The curator closed the book gently. "Do you have anything on him? Dog tags, photos, letters?" Frank nodded. "I have it all. His family never got his things. I kept them. I told myself I'd find them someday. I never did." The curator said they'd need documentation, maybe a witness statement, to begin the inclusion process. Frank promised he'd be back. That night, at home, Frank dug through the tin box he kept in his closet. Dog tags, still dirty. A black and white photo of a grinning young man with a cigarette in his mouth. And a letter Frank had written but never sent, meant for Connor's mother. He reread it now, hands shaking. "Mrs. Connors," it began, "your son was a hero." He didn't hesitate. Frank wept as he folded the letter. He stayed up all night writing his statement, printing photos, even recording a voice message explaining what happened. The next morning, he returned to the museum, documents in hand, and placed them on the curator's desk. "Do what you need," he said. "Just make sure he's not forgotten." As he turned to leave, the curator stopped him. "Mr. Delaney, would you be willing to speak at the ceremony if we approve his name?" Frank paused. "Ceremony?" "Yes. If we add him to the wall, we do it right." Frank swallowed hard. "I'll be there," he said. Outside, the sky had clouded over, but Frank felt lighter somehow. Like a promise had been made, one long overdue. Frank spent the next several days carefully assembling the pieces of Joseph Connor's forgotten story. In the quiet of his home, surrounded by boxes from the attic, he sifted through dusty journals, faded photos, and old letters sealed with time and grief. He even found the platoon photo from 1968, there they were, all young, sweaty, smiling despite the jungle heat, with Connors in the middle, grinning wide with his arm around Frank's shoulders. Frank brought it all to the museum the following week in a weathered envelope. The curator, who now addressed him with genuine respect, took the contents with reverence and told Frank they had submitted everything to the Board of Veteran Affairs for official inclusion. "It might take time," the curator said softly. "But we'll keep you updated." Frank nodded, clutching his hat to his chest. He left with a strange mix of hope and heaviness. Weeks passed. Then months. Frank would visit the wall every Sunday, standing quietly where Connor's name should have been, always pausing for several minutes, whispering under his breath, as if he were still speaking to his old friend. People passed by and sometimes asked if he was looking for someone. He would smile and say, "Just waiting for a correction." One Sunday, as leaves turned to fire orange and gold, Frank arrived to find a small envelope at the museum's front desk with his name on it. Inside was a typed letter from the Veterans Memorial Oversight Committee. "We are pleased to inform you that Private First Class Joseph Connors will be formally added to the Vietnam Memorial Wall on November 11th, during our annual Veterans Day ceremony." Frank stared at the words for several long minutes, his eyes blurring with tears. The ceremony was only a few weeks away. Determined to make it meaningful, Frank reached out to the few surviving members of their unit. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He even spoke to a local high school history class about Joseph Connors and the cost of memory. As the day approached, the museum coordinated with the city to plan the event. Frank was asked to speak. He spent 3 nights working on a short speech, rewriting every sentence until it felt right. When November 11th arrived, the city was quiet with early morning mist. The museum steps were lined with folding chairs, flags, and a podium adorned with a wreath. Frank wore his old uniform jacket, tight in the shoulders but still intact. When he arrived, the curator greeted him with a warm handshake and led him to the front row. He sat silently as speakers came and went, officials, historians, even a congressman, but when Frank's name was called, the crowd hushed with a reverence that surprised even him. He stepped up, voice trembling as he looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, strangers and veterans. He began by telling them about a 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn who loved to sing, who carried a picture of his mom in his helmet, who made everyone laugh no matter how bad things got. He told them about that day, the ambush, the grenade, the selfless moment that changed everything. "I was 22 and terrified," Frank said. "And he was younger, braver, and quicker. Because of him, I got to live. And all I ever wanted was to make sure his name lived too." As he stepped down, silence lingered, then applause rose from the crowd, not loud, not forced, but deep and steady. A museum official approached the wall, now draped in a black cloth. With a gentle tug, the cloth fell away to reveal the freshly engraved name, Joseph A. Connors. Frank pressed his hand to the cold stone, his voice barely a whisper. "You're home now." After the ceremony, dozens approached him, young veterans, students, families. They thanked him. Some cried. One little boy gave Frank a drawing of an American flag and said, "This is for your friend." That night, Frank returned home, exhausted and full. He sat at his kitchen table, placed the boy's drawing next to the old photo of his unit, and poured himself a small glass of whiskey. For the first time in years, he felt peace. He took out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a new letter. "Dear Joe," he wrote. "They know now. They all know." In the weeks following the ceremony, Frank found his days quieter, but not empty. There was a subtle change in the air, a release of something heavy that had lived in his chest for decades. Each morning, he'd sit by the window with his coffee and stare at the envelope now framed on the wall, the one that confirmed Joseph Connors had finally been recognized. He still visited the museum every Sunday, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He would sit on the bench near the memorial wall and watch people pass by, some stopping to read the names, others leaving flowers, some simply standing in silence. Occasionally, a parent would kneel beside a child and whisper the story of a name etched in stone, and Frank would smile faintly, knowing how important it was for these stories to be passed down. One day, as he was preparing to leave, a young woman approached him with a folded newspaper in her hand. "Are you Mr. Frank Whitaker?" she asked. He nodded. She held out the paper, pointing to an article, "Local Veteran Helps Restore Forgotten Heroes' Legacy." Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "Joseph Connors was my uncle. My mom was his sister. She passed a few years ago, but she talked about him every day." Frank didn't speak. He simply stood, then embraced her, and in that moment, it was as if time had folded in on itself, closing a circle that had been open for too long. They sat together, and he told her everything, not just about the war, but about Joe's laugh, the way he sang horribly off-key, the ridiculous jokes he told to make them forget where they were. She cried, and he did too. Later that night, Frank wrote another letter, this time to Joe's sister, even though she was gone. He wrote it for the sake of saying what hadn't been said, for honoring not only the soldier but the family who waited for him. Days turned into weeks. Frank's story began to circulate. The museum invited him to speak at several local events. Schools asked him to visit. Young veterans reached out, and suddenly Frank's phone rang more often. He didn't mind. For the first time in years, he felt like he was still part of something. One snowy December afternoon, he received a small package in the mail. Inside was a shadow box, beautifully crafted, containing a replica of Joseph Connors' medal with a plaque that read, "For valor, for sacrifice, for friendship." There was also a note, "Thank you for not letting him be forgotten." The Connors family. Frank placed the box next to the framed photo of their platoon and whispered, "You made it, Joe. You finally made it." That winter was colder than most, but Frank bundled up and made his weekly trips to the museum without fail. People had started leaving small notes beneath Joe's name, messages of thanks, drawings from children, even a few medals pinned by other veterans. The wall had become more than stone. It had become alive with memory. As spring approached, Frank began slowing down. His steps weren't as steady, his breath not as full. But he kept moving. One warm Sunday morning, a young man in uniform approached him outside the museum. "Sir," he said, "my grandfather served with your unit. He always talked about two men, Joe and Frank. I just wanted to meet you." They talked for nearly an hour. The young soldier asked questions, and Frank answered every one with care, like someone passing on sacred knowledge. When the soldier left, Frank sat back on the bench and closed his eyes. The sun was warm on his face, and the air carried the soft sound of birds and children laughing somewhere nearby. A museum staff member walked by and said, "You okay, Mr. Whitaker?" Frank smiled and nodded. Never better. That night, Frank sat down at his desk and took out one last sheet of paper. He wrote, "Dear Joe, it's been a long road, but I think I finally did right by you. I've told your story. They know your name. They remember. I think I'll rest a bit now. Thanks for waiting." He folded the letter, placed it with the others, and turned off the light. The next morning, Frank didn't wake up. They found him in his chair, peaceful, his hand resting on the photo of their unit. The museum held a memorial service a week later. Veterans and strangers filled the room. A seat was left empty beside the podium with a single name tag, Joseph H. Connors. And beneath the memorial wall, etched in brass, a new plaque read, "Dedicated to Frank Whitaker, the man who remembered."